morning, Nigeria, and a beautiful new week to you. Welcome to today's newspaper review. Let's start with the Guardian newspaper. On the Guardian newspaper, the lead page says overlapping budgets. How weak budgeting culture aids graft, poverty, ghost allocations. You get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper. Then in the middle of the same newspaper on page 3, electricity subsidy hits 1.78 trillion naira as gas debt nears 1 trillion naira. Still in the same middle of the newspaper, OE seeks CBN intervention, says Nigerians paying over 300% interest on digital loan apps. You get the full story on page 3 of the newspaper. Then at the bottom of the newspaper, this is coming from the INEC chairman. He says that voter registration closes amid concerns over access, election credibility. The full story is on page 6 of the newspaper. Then military rescues 48 adoptees in Zamfara as ISWA finance chief surrenders in Borno State. The full story is on page 9 of the newspaper. We move away from that newspaper to the Punch newspaper. On the Punch newspaper, it says that federal government budgets 1 trillion naira for empowerment SUVs amid rising borrowing pressure. You continue reading on page 2 of the newspaper. Then on page 32 of the newspaper, opposition splits over single candidate to challenge Tinubu. The opposition party are splitting into single candidates to challenge President Bola Ahmed Tinubu comes 2027. You get the full story on page 33 of the newspaper. Then by the right side of the newspaper on page 32, APC drafts Omisore into 276-member Osun Governor Campaign Council. You get the full story on page 32 of the newspaper. Federal government raises varsity workers hazard allowance to 486,000 naira. You get the full story on page 8 of the newspaper as well. Then this is on page 8 of the newspaper. Fake agency scandal. Reps grilled accountant general today. Still in the regards to the PFIPC scandal. Still in the same newspaper, Obasanjo's role in Obi Kwankwaso ticket sparks row. You get the full story on page 9 of the newspaper. Recall that the former president Olusegun Obasanjo is behind the Obi Kwankwaso ticket come 2027, and then he has sparked a lot of controversy in Nigeria. We move away from that newspaper to the Daily Trust. On the Daily Trust newspaper, how gunmen abducted Kebbi High Court judge. You continue reading on page 3 of the newspaper. Find out how this gunmen succeeded in abducting a chief judge in Kebbi State. Then on page 6 of the newspaper in the middle, Islamic board to spend 18 billion naira on staff. Still in the same newspaper, soldiers selling uniforms to terrorists arrested. You get the full story on page 7 of the newspaper. Soldiers that are behind selling of uniforms to terrorists are being arrested. Then votes will count. INEC vows as voter registration ends. The full story is on page 13 of the newspaper. INEC has promised that votes this time around is going to count because the registration has already ended. On page 4 of the newspaper, flooding. Where is local government's 82 billion naira ecological fund? This is a question that people are asking for this ecological fund. Then at the bottom of the newspaper, ex-defense spokesman demands 250,000 naira salary for soldiers. Still in the same newspaper on page 41, NDLEA intercepts 10 billion naira drugs at Lagos port. We will move away from that newspaper to the New Telegraph. On the New Telegraph newspaper, on 2027 campaign director general Yari Almakura Oshomole Uzodinma top contenders as APC compiles PCC list. You get the full story on page 3 and 7 of the newspaper. Then at the top of the newspaper, Nigerians paying over 300% interest on digital loan apps. You get the full story on page 4 of the newspaper. Then at the bottom of the newspaper, how senior ISWA finance operative 46 others surrender to troops. You get the full story on page 3, 4, 5, and 10 of the newspaper. Then on page 2 and 27 of the newspaper, U.S. lawmaker asks federal government to release Nnamdi Kanu or face 8 courts. That's coming from the U.S. lawmakers. Recall that Nnamdi Kanu, the IPOB leader, has been in detention at Sokoto Correctional Center. Now, the U.S. lawmakers are asking the federal government to either release him or they face 8 courts. Then on page 2 and 7 of the newspaper, this is coming from the NDC presidential candidate, Peter Obi. Tinubu tired, should be allowed to retire in peace. Peter Obi says that President Bola Ahmed Tinubu is tired and he should be allowed to retire in peace. That's only if the president will accept that he's actually tired and wants retirement. We move away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun. On the Daily Sun newspaper, governors push for state police takeoff. The full story is on page 6 of the newspaper. Then at the top of the newspaper on page 6 as well, Enugu emerges Nigeria's fastest improving state. Wow, that is amazing. Enugu state is emerging as Nigeria's fastest growing state. But by the left side of the newspaper, tracker raises alarm as federal government budget 962.83 billion naira for SUVs. This is money the federal government would have used in empowering Nigerian youths, but instead they are using it for SUVs and other empowerments. They should rather channel these resources to improving the lives of the youths rather than budgeting it for an SUV. Still in the same newspaper on page 26, budget. Federal government moves to appease National Assembly members. The federal government are moving to appeal National Assembly members. Then on page 2 of the newspaper, move fast on AI or miss out. This is coming from the International Monetary Fund. They are telling Africans to either move fast or they miss out on them AI because the world is moving and AI is now dominating the entire world. We'll move away from that newspaper to the Daily Monitor. On the Daily Monitor newspaper, coming from the NDC presidential candidate Peter Obi, he is saying that President Tinubu is tired and he needs to retire, that Nigeria needs fresh leaders and not old cargoes. Nigeria needs fresh leaders and not our elders. Then on page 2 of the newspaper, Army nabbed soldiers declared wanted for supplying military gears to terrorists. Army nabbed soldiers declared wanted for supplying military gear to terrorists. Still in the same newspaper, on page 3 of the newspaper, NULGE falls delay in implementing local government financial autonomy. Then at the bottom of the newspaper on page 1 of the newspaper, Atiku falls federal government's domestic borrowing, demands account of oil windfall. That's coming from the ADC presidential candidate Atiku Abubakar. He's faulting the federal government's domestic borrowing and he is demanding for account of the oil windfall. We move away from that newspaper to the Matrix newspaper. On the Matrix newspaper, 2027, Obi unveils plans for Nigeria. Then the middle of the newspaper, report uncovers over 962.8 billion naira SUV cost, empowering projects in 2026 budget. Then at the top of the newspaper, CPPE, why Trump's new 12.5% export tariffs won't hurt Nigerian much. The full story is on page 3 of the newspaper. Then at the bottom of the newspaper on entertainment on page 23, BB Niger Season 11 housemate review. Recall that yesterday happened to be the launching of the Season 11 of the Big Brother Niger, and the housemates have been revealed. So if you're a fan of Big Brother Niger, you should do well to follow up on the series. Then on page 2 of the newspaper, Ocean decides. Akpabio, Abbas, Uzodinma, Boni lead APC campaign cancel. Still in the same newspaper, on page 9, La Cospa, FCCPC sign MOU to strengthen consumer protection in Lagos. LASCOPA, FCCPC sign MOU to strengthen consumer protection in Lagos State. Away from that newspaper to our last newspaper for today, which is the Daily Independent. On the Daily Independent, high rate government borrowing threaten private credit recovery. The full story is on page 29 of the newspaper. Gunmen abduct High Court judge in Kebbi. You get the full story on page 6 of the newspaper. Serap sues NNPCL over failure to account for 211 trillion naira oil funds. You get the full story on page 4 of the newspaper. Then by the right side of the newspaper, federal government boosts health education admissions to curb professional deficits. You get the full story on page 7 of the newspaper. Lastly, on this segment, CBN boosts cyber defense with new security operations center. The full story is on page 29 of the newspaper. We've come to the end of the newspaper review. Many thanks for watching, and do stay tuned for more updates.